I'll just hit the record button and we're off and racing. So this is the last session, basically. I mean, next week I'll hold another, but it'll just be a social session. Essentially, it's just a week to finish off next week where we look at the Chemical Maze, the app that we actually acquired at the start of the year. Now, a lot of students sort of say, are of the mindset that science is a difficult thing to do, that it's a hard framework, it's so book-ended and so bookish that it can be difficult to get going in a classroom. So the whole aim of the Chemical Maze app is to actually take science out of the classroom and actually locate it in students' lives and houses. And so next week there's a whole range of speaking of resources and tasks that you can actually look at when you're using the Chemical Maze app. And even though you've only got one app, it may be on your mobile phone, it's still not going to stop students from working collaboratively and cooperatively in really, really positive learning models that we've looked at this term in some of the Science by Doing, some of the primary connections and some of the science Teachers Association materials that we've talked about this week. So let's get going. We talked about resources this week, and I also posted a content session for you on really which looked at professional identity and the future of schooling. So what we did last week, and normally in these sessions, the Zoom sessions, I'll try and get conversation going by rehashing the week's content, talking about some issues coming out of the forums and looking at links to assessment. But really I'm relying on you guys driving any questions that may come up at this particular point in time. And I'm sure being the last week of the course, there's bound to be a few. So last week we went back to the future. We had a look at what's going to happen to science and science education. And we began by taking a helicopter view and zooming out, literally zooming out to the year 2030 and what we know about the world. And we can see it's a place of change. It's a place of considerable, discontinuous change, is the term often thrown around. Global temperatures are rising, populations 8.5 billion, seas have gone up 40 centimetres since 2016. The models don't capture that in full. I mean, we're actually understanding now, even in 2017, that our models are underestimating the sea rise. The Arctic Ocean will be ice-free every summer, and several low-lying countries will lose their fresh water supplies because of the rising salt waters. So what we're going to see is in many cities dominated by climatic events. New Mexico, we're looking at this now. We're looking all through the coast of the US and the Americas, and Mexico again. We're starting to see with some of the third world countries up around the Americas being decimated by massive tornadoes and cyclones. 40 million refugees, environmental refugees, are going to be settled away from their homes. And we know that the backlash that's going to create, we're seeing that in Rohingya now, with the Rohingyas in Myanmar and Bangladesh. Now, Bangladesh is a place that floods. It's a low-lying valley. Essentially those people migrate anyway, but they've gone into Burma seeking safety, and the backlash of that, the environmental backlash, of course, has turned into religious or ethnic cleansing. So we're seeing, all of these climate-related disasters costing billions of dollars. And what that means is governments have to redirect their funding. Spending is cut on social infrastructure and investment, and it's diverted to aid and repair. Schooling is part of that. And the forecasts in future school is that teachers are actually going to be laid off, instructional hours are going to be cut, even perhaps the total years of schooling, compulsory schooling. And this is coming out of Canada. This is coming out of a global summit looking at environmental education and environmental change. But in some regions, they're starting to see this writing on the wall already. And we're starting to see new schools with new curricula, with new educational models as to what science education will look like on a changing planet. So these schools are already setting up. There's international schools. In Bali, for instance, you've got the Green School, which is a P to 12 school. We've got the examples all right across the planet of schools that are going forward with new models. So what have we got? The Equinox Summit in Canada looked at what the future may be like in 2030, and some of the real changes we can see here that have already been mentioned in the Australian curriculum. No grades, no exams, no teachers. Now, that seems a bit excessive. But what we're moving towards is stage-based, not age-based learning, and this is really critical. So the model is coming out of Canada and Eastern Europe and Western Europe also, getting rid of grades 9 to 12 and replacing them with project-based work. It's already happening in some schools here in Australia. Down in Tasmania, for instance, there's a really strong movement towards this. We're starting to see schools no longer age-based, but more project-based. And the reasons are there. We call it stage-based learning, using portfolios. So a kid will come in there, and the whole aim here is to tackle disengagement. Now, one of the biggest problems, as we know from our research on science education, students are opting out of the sciences in high schools. In primary schools, we're really having to force them to do it. It's not one of the subjects they're falling in love with. So an iteration of that has become STEM or STEAM or STEAM, but really, getting back to science. We're trying to get students to engage with science. So moving away from age-based learning like we see in the ACS, where you'll do this unit, this level, and beyond this, and then you'll link it to that. And this will be your elaboration. We're starting to see students come into schools, and these schools actually exist, as I said, in Tasmania at the moment. Quaker schools, they're called, where kids come into them and they actually come in with a project or an interest, and their entire learning plan is designed around that particular interest. And so it can take them through where they produce a portfolio and they will demonstrate all their essential learnings in that portfolio. And again, we can see disengagement is a big motivator. Autonomous in pursuing their passions. It creates 360-degree assessment because your portfolio can actually be assessed by anybody, not just your teacher. And this is one of the limitations of education. At the moment, you're locked in the room with a teacher, and let's face it, Mrs. Jones may be a wonderful person, but essentially she's just Mrs. Jones. Now, out there in the real world, there are so many other people who could be contributing to your learning. And this new model says, no teachers, let's have, villages. It takes a village, said McEwen, to raise a child. So, now let's get a village to educate them. So we're moving towards including NGOs, private organisations, and the general public. Now, once upon a time, Education Queensland, anyone who's taught in Education Queensland schools knows that you can't scratch yourself without getting permission from the principal. But let's face it, students are already exposed to everything from propaganda to partisan politics. So there's a fair element of in education now that's throwing that constraint away, saying, forget about it. Let's move into an area where we can actually open students to the world, not so much the world of censorship, but the world of learning. So some big changes coming. And you guys are going to be part of that. You're going to be part of that in your teaching careers. We then went on last week to talk about the problem with schooling, and I spent a long time looking at the conflicting theories around schooling and a movement called the Unschooling Movement. Now, has anyone heard of the Unschooling Movement before?
Yeah, I've read a little bit about it.
And what have you heard?
Oh, my sister's quite interested for her son because he's struggling. We think he might have like ADHD or something like that. He's still to be diagnosed, but yeah, she's very keen to get him into like a more hands-on, do what he wants to do that interests him type of environment. So
precisely, and look, this is I made a confession in last week's lecture. I mean, my eldest daughter was actually homeschooled for a period of time. She was going through some difficult social adjustments in her life, and we just shifted from one area to another. And so we set up this elaborate, amazing homeschooling program for her, where she had her own piano teacher and music teacher. She did singing, she did art, she did science. She worked in museums and did all sorts. Had an amazing year in year 9. And of course, for her, it rekindled her love of learning. And of course, she went on to a very successful academic career. But what we're talking about now is this whole notion of unschooling. It's a lot of people are getting into it. The homeschooling movement's really strong. Last week, I pointed to the notion that Charters Towers, schools of distance education, is the largest school in Queensland. Now, it's not one that we'd normally point to and say, wow, there's a model for a future school, but actually it is. The curriculum is still Queensland-based, but eventually it will start getting into its, that the curriculum will loosen up. We're starting to find that now because teachers, let's face it, are doing more and more coercion. NAPLANs, at most of the major year and learning intervals. We're starting to see year 11 and 12 are all geared towards high stakes outcome assessment. So what we're starting to see is a schooling system where kids are being coerced through a system. It's a sausage factory. And the unschooling movement tries to address this. And one of the resources I put on the webpage for you this week was by Simon Springer. Has anyone read the Springer article?
I think I read it. I've read a lot of stuff this week, but I think I read some of it.
Good, yeah. And what did you think? Did you form an opinion about Springer and his ideas?
I thought it was fabulous, actually. I'm really keen on this idea too. I've got some kids in school at the moment, and I feel like sometimes, I don't know, they don't get to have as much fun as what I think they should. It should be enjoyable learning, and I don't know. yeah, I'm a big fan of like the Stephanie Alexander gardening and stuff like that. Children learning through life skills as well as just sitting in a classroom.
Yeah, precisely. It's a really rich interface, and this is growing. And on last week's lecture actually pointed to many of the sites in Queensland where this is happening. And, you know, teachers who are in a system are working away, and they're actually seeing what the system's doing to kids. You know, they're seeing schooling is very different to education, and that's the whole point we're making here. And we're seeing what schooling is doing to kids, and it's actually creating disengagement. And that then, you know, what do you do with the child who's then
We're expecting them to act like little robots and stay seated and just give us answers, I feel like, some of the time, instead of having a creative mind, and I don't know.
Precisely. And here's, you know, I won't go back through the discussion we had last week, but just to place you, you know, students feel a clear divide between schooling and learning. They know that there's a difference between the two processes. Our current assessment models constrain ambition and the pursuit of passion. Let's face it, how many kids really want to write a report or do that? You know, they don't. They want to make bombs and blow things up and do this and do that and make slime and, you know, rub it on their friends or drop chocolate buddies down someone's, you know, the back of someone's trousers, that sort of stuff. School has limited them in understanding the realities of the world, and this is because school is about one teacher, 1 year. If you go to high school, you've got a couple of different teachers, but let's face it, they're all divided into curricula too. You know, it's a really limited, you know, slice of the cake model. And in the past few decades, school has succeeded in only one aspect, and this is what the research basically says. Every single piece of research, it actually decouples itself from the idea of learning. In other words, school is becoming less and less a learning environment. Now, that's pretty scary, isn't it? And you know, I'm not saying let's back off school, but what I'm saying is teachers, pick up that challenge. You know, it's becoming possible for you to pick up that challenge. The Australian Curriculum in Science is all about negotiating learning. And so what we're seeing across the world, you know, the 2030 project, it's called Imagine 2030, where a whole lot of teachers are engaged in shaping global education for the future. And it's primarily science oriented too. But they're talking about new teaching and learning ecologies where teaching expertise with new discoveries in brain research and cutting edge technology. So a kid will come into your school. You will do a couple of years in primary school where they're doing play-based learning, and then on the basis of that, they're going to come up with their own individualised, brain-based schooling program. That's a pretty amazing model, isn't it? For every kid in the school. And of course, it constantly gets negotiated and updated because that's what brain-based research is. It's constantly forming. You know, we know all about myelination and the reformation of the brain. It's constantly remaking itself. So this is a very live pedagogy. Schools becoming community hubs. Seamless connections, teachers, students, families, with local and distant professionals, volunteers and businesses, all working together, the village educating the child. I remember, you know, this is back to the future. That's what schools used to be like. And of course, innovative teachers. You may be a teacher for 2 days of the week, and for 3 days of the week, you may be engaged in finance or microbanking, or you could be engaged in something ecological. Either way, your teaching job is bringing the real world to your classroom, and your classroom is meeting the real world through your teaching. So, you know, it's a different sort of model that we're looking at the Imagine 2030 project, and we're starting to see some really bright futures for schools, even though they'll be in quite dark educational times. We're already starting to see the divide between, you know, disenfranchised state schools in low socioeconomic areas and you know, quite wealthy private and independent schools, and of course the Catholic schools treading somewhere in between, trying to keep afloat. So we talked about the changing planet, we talked about the consequences, and we talked about the disruptions to the earth, and the challenge, you know, the opportunity for science to fit in there, and for a science pedagogy to come in and really kick in. We looked at the new schooling model that's coming through. This is the Earth education. It's a global model, and it comes largely through a lot of the play-based schools, the Steiner School, the Reggio Emilia schools, the baccalaureate schools, the community schools, the international schools, and they're setting a global agenda. And so we're starting to see the science, the Australian curriculum in science, start to align with these goals. We can see one of the priorities of the Australian system is sustainability. And here it is in the new schooling, the Earth education models. Now, I won't talk too much about this other than sort of say, you know, we've got our 5 factors here. Earth dependence, we depend on the planet. We're interdependent. What we do has an effect on the planet and on each other. We have to be creative. Social entrepreneurship is a big thing, particularly in Asia at the moment. Now, I don't know, in Singapore, a friend of mine, he's 32 years old, brilliant young man. He was an ex-student of mine at Griffith University, Ben Leong. He headed up a company called Singtel, which is the equivalent of Telstra here in Australia, except there you can imagine the size of it being Singapore. And at the ripe old age of 32, Ben retired and went into social entrepreneurship programs. Now, Ben brokers about $200 million a year between different organisations, setting up sustainable communities and sustainable schools. So, there's really interesting things happening in the world. Our goal is, to, even though we may be in an educational system where principals are basically, suggesting this has got to be done yesterday, that's got to be done the week before, but what we're challenging in Free Air's critical consciousness model is we've got to become earth-centric leaders. We've actually got to look through, if we've got to look through the falseness, we've got to look through the hypocritic nature of systems to actually work with the people whom they're meant to serve. And in this case, it's meant to be our students. So some of the educational alternatives to schooling. Now, I went into a bit of this last week. The unschooling. Do have a look at it. It is quite radical, and in terms of isms, it is anarchy. And it is an argument against establishment. So what we've got here is a group of educators trying to actually come up with alternative models for schooling, and this is not fiction. This is happening in Queensland. It's happening right across Australia. And you may, as a teacher, either start up your own. I know several teachers who have. Or you may go working for some of these organisations. And what we're finding more and more is a lot of the well-to-do schools are actually enrolling their students in these programs. So have a look at that as we go through. Springer, Simon Springer, there's some of his ideas. Schooling reinforces the excesses and absurdities of the contemporary world, trying to mould people and make them fit in. And we also need to put down what we have our curriculum map. And the Australian Curriculum Science is trying to do this. Put down the curriculum map and enjoy the scenery. And it does that by providing teachers with a whole range of resources you can choose from. So take a journey without a predetermined destination. It's got to be inquiry-based and just justify in terms of, you're learning what you're trying to do. And hence that's assessment task number 2. So the ACS tries to do this, learner-centred, inquiry-driven, open-ended, negotiated curriculum. It's a middle path. It's not an ideal one, but it does remove coercion. And, if kids come to school, look at the dichotomy, teacher-student, one of those is powerful, one is not. Child-adult, one is powerful, one is not. If you look at it, this is a system of coercion based on the subjugation of a child. Children are put into weaker positions. They're basic, as people, they're not seen as people. They're seen as something wrong with the child. They need to be guided. Their worldview is not elaborate. Talk to children and you realise how rich their world is. They may have misconceptions, the Australian curriculum, but those misconceptions, in the guide of another, really wise person can actually be corrected and managed. But the important thing is they're making decisions about what they want to do. And that was the whole purpose of this week's materials. We talked about resources, and I'm going to talk about a few of the ones that we've got on the site for you today. And some of them are quite good. A little exercise, where does schooling and education fit together? And, I went through the history of that really schooling always was a home-based practice. It's only when we went to mass industrialisation that kids on the streets became a problem. And those kids mostly were the kids of poor working class people, predominantly Catholics. And so the religious order of the days back in after settlement and prior to the Federation came up with our first educational act, which basically made compulsory schooling the norm. Most of the wealthy people were already in schools, already being schooled in the classics, the music, the art, the literature. That was already being done. Oscar Wilde, one of my favourite poets and playwrights, a map of the world does not include utopia is not worth even glancing at, for it leaves out the one country which humanity is always landing. Think about that. We as teachers often, we're in education because, generally we have a worldview that we want to see change. We want to see maximised. We want to see better outcomes. And essentially, we want to see not nirvana, but utopia. We want to see a world that is going to be better than the one that we inherited. So it's a question of science. And we asked and put up a couple of these little questions here. What science are you going to teach? You're going to teach electricity, you're going to teach circuits. You may do that. But there's also a couple of things once we get away from the understandings. There's a couple of things called, you know, the human endeavours and the inquiry skills that we can really put to work here, and that can really drive a lot of science understanding. And, you know, I put up a couple of these questions last week. Telcos, of course, they can't get insurance because of the epidemic of brain tumours and that we're about to see explode in the world, or the latency period for those is coming to an end. Telcos can't get insurance. So, you know, and hence, if you look at the stock market, this is why Telstra's share prices invariably underperform, because this is sitting in their future. The average Aussie bloke's sperm count dropped by 49%. Be careful where you keep your phone, hopefully not in your front pocket. Schools in Cyprus, this is so strong, electromagnetic fields, and what it does to the body and the mutation of the body systems over time. They've withdrawn Wi-Fi from school buildings. Now, these are really good questions to ask. Why? You know, Roundup. Once upon a time, only 15 years ago, used to kill our crops. Now all of our crops don't kill. They all get sprayed with Roundup before they're harvested and put into our food. Interesting, isn't it? Why? Of course, they've been modified. They genetically have a genome in them now, which actually is Roundup. And of course, Roundup doesn't kill Roundup. It makes them resistant, so it's been bred into the plant. So we can see this now. We're actually eating toxic foods. Congratulations.
Exactly.
Sorry?
That's very, very true.
Yeah, it is. And in this week's material, I actually send you to some discussion forums and to some blogs and podcasts where you can actually get more information on this. And this is a really interesting one. There's a substance in.
What's the safety in New Zealand? Yes.
So there is a substance in genetically modified organisms in foods in Australia, when they test these foods with rats, the dose they actually test with rats, and it turns into fatty liver disease in rats, is actually 437,500 times less than our own safety measures. So, you know, the science is, you know, are we asking the real science questions? So some of the resources we point to this week, and hopefully you've had a look at some of these. The Queensland, Central Queensland Uni Library has got a great resource that linked directly to primary resources. And of course, you'll see the standard ones, Scoodle, ABC Splash. There's a whole range of ones in there. Go and have a look at them because they're actually all laid out for you and all directly linked. So the University Library's done a lot of work for you here as a pre-service teacher. ASTO, the Australian Science Teachers Association, if you go into that particular site, you'll see fantastic units of study laid out by the Australian curriculum strands. So it's another alternative way of dealing with your science teaching. STEM Network, if you go to QSEN, it's really interesting. I went in there and there doesn't seem to be too much live activity, which makes me wonder, is STEM real? Or is STEM just an interface that we're going through, just a stage we're going through? The Code Club of Australia has some great resources for coding. And if you're a coder, you can actually enroll there and become a mentor on site to your local clubs. Double Helix, when my daughter was homeschooled, she was a member of the Double Helix Club, and used to do online experiments with the Double Helix teachers and everything during their presentations. Great stuff. Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. Have a look at all of these things. They are fantastic resources. CVA, the Conservation Volunteers, really, really good resources. New Scientists, just a fantastic magazine for, you know, coming up with the latest scientific discoveries. And the nice thing about New Scientists is the language is generally accessible to most upper primary school kids. Evil Mad Scientist often has some great experiments to come up with and some great interactions. And the Bristlebot is a really simple one. If you get kids to bring in an old mobile phone, all you do is take the vibrator motor of the mobile phone, a standard battery and a toothbrush, and you can actually, just using some back-to-back tape, you can actually just create a little Bristlebot that races around a table at lightning speeds. You can dress it up as a mouse, you can dress it up as a whole range of things and scare teachers, dress it up as a spider, it actually sends the willies up people. You can have a lot of fun with the Bristlebot, really simple stuff to do and great science when you're looking at circuits. And you can also then cross that from circuits into animals, insects and biology. So the Nature Play Site Queensland is great for early childhood. Now, sometimes we get criticised for not putting up too many early childhood resources, but if you go into Nature Play Queensland, it's a really, really good site. It's one of those sites I was talking about where teachers have actually left the system and gone in to create a system of their own. And they've come up with this great resource, and there's fantastic lesson plans. There's also club meets, and there's also regional centres and regional activities, and they also have a bush kindergarten movement in there too. So really good resources. So there's something in here for us all to jump in and join, you know, this new earth, this new science, this new global connectivity that's going on. There's resources there for us all to use, and we can begin with the Australian curriculum. But let's face it, how well we know the Australian curriculum is just the beginning. We can then go to science teachers, we can go to STEM, we can go through coding, double helix, we can look at all of these applications, conservation, new emergences and new scientists, nature play, first Lego League, one of my own favourites, you know, fantastic stuff, giving kids the keys to the kingdom where they can become scientists and come up with their own research projects. And in Townsville, of course, we've got the Museum of Tropical Queensland, which is just a great resource. Now, I won't take you through each of those, but I will encourage you, and I know you're right up to your ears in things at the moment. You've got a few subjects going on and a few coming to an end. But when they do, you know, sit back and try and enjoy a post-coital cigarette. Just sit there and have a look at some of these resources and try to imagine the ones that you're going to gravitate to as a teacher. Which ones would you go to actually raise some of those new science issues? You know, why are we doing what we're doing? Why are the foods we're eating what they are? What's happening to our bodies? What's happening to our capacities? All of these different things. And here's some of the schools I talked to you about. You know, this is not my imagination. This is not something I'm making up. This is just a quick scan of the alternate schooling options. And you can see Earth's Cool, an alternate, they're basically a learning group. And what they do is they're consultants. They will either offer you online programs for your school, offer you the resources, or they'll come and deliver it for you. The C School, same. Green Edge Catalyst, the same. Nature Play, that's the site we've just talked about before, back on the links page. Journey Outdoors in Nature, fantastic stuff. Grow, a great little schooling, alternate schooling model. Beach Care. As you can see, teachers are taking their craft. They're taking their craft to this new sustainable science model, and they're building new school options, you know, right throughout the Queensland state. These are only Queensland options, okay, and they're not even half of what exists. Point number 3 from the forums, and getting on to assessment task number 2. I'm going to pause here and open the floor for some questions before I talk about criteria 1 and 2. I had a question from criteria 1 and 2. Can I explain them? I'll do that. And also another question from Melanie Worth about criteria 4, which somehow we've had a bit of trouble with the Moodle this year, dropping down, picking up, dropping down. That's why I haven't put all the resources available till the last couple of weeks. And what's happened, of course, it's when it's dropped down at some stage, it's rebooted with an old version of the marking sheet, and criteria 4 doesn't appear as as it's going to be properly graded. So Melanie raised the point, you know, hopefully that reporting to parents is a mistake. Yes, what it's done is loaded an old sheet, and I'll go through the new criteria 4, which really is just about your report format. So any questions from you guys first before I go through that? The forums were pretty quiet this week, actually, so I imagine people are up to their necks, engaged in a lot of different tasks. Any particular questions? If you're thinking it, you can guarantee there are 10 other people thinking it. So now
I just have a question, Colin.
Fire away.
In a session, I think it was last week or the week before, you said to either use formative, summative, diagnostic as the terms, or use assessment of, for, as learning. But on the criteria sheet, it says, well, I don't know if this is an old one, because the one I have used has the reporting to parents section as well. So, yeah. But it has a lot of those terms on the marking sheet, and I was using formative, summative, diagnostic, but on the criteria it's got assessment as, for, etc. Right,
yes, okay. So basically we can talk about that with the sheet we've got on the screen at the moment. Just get my mouse operative here. It seems to run onto a different screen. So what we've got, the criteria 1, explanation of formative and summative assessment used in each of the 2 units of work, at least 4 items per unit, explicit identification of the types of units, 4 of, as used in each of the units. Now, that basically it is what we're talking about with your formative and your summative. We can also include diagnostic in there when we're talking about assessment 4. Okay, but by and large, this assignment is not about diagnostic assessment, but you are quite welcome to include the diagnostic assessment in your breakdown of the unit. Because, and we said this in the forums before, you know, do we include, you're not wrong if you do include it, but you're under no compulsion to include it, okay? The reason you might include it is because it completes the picture of assessment in a unit. You want to give an oversight of the assessment in a particular unit, and you want to say it begins at the diagnostic stage in this particular lesson and then goes right through the formative stage. Here's a couple of examples, and here's a couple of examples of the summative assessment in this unit, okay? And then you would explain each and link them to understandings, to motivation and to engagement. So the terms for, of, and as basically are interchangeable with diagnostic, formative, and summative. So if you're covering formative and summative and not using for, of, and as, do not worry, okay, because they will be read. And as you can see here, for instance, it goes on summative, sophisticated explanation of the formative and summative assessment used in each of the 2 units of work, explicit identification of types of assessment used. So it doesn't, you know, it's given up, breaking up for, of, and as. As you can see, the criteria basically are just referring to your assessment types. Whether you include diagnostic is up to you, but you must include formative and summative. And if you've done that, fine, that's great. Some students are preferring to talk about it as assessment for, assessment of, assessment as. Some are preferring to talk about it as formative and summative. It's entirely up to you. There's no right answer. They're all types of assessment, and as long as you're consistent with your terms, the assignment should make perfect sense to a marker. Does that help with that question?
Yeah, that's good. I originally used like formative and summative, but then when I was reading the criteria, I thought I should go back through and change it. But then I lost my assignment anyway. It didn't save properly, so I'm in the stage of redoing.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah,
no, it's IT. I always save. I don't know what happened.
Yeah, that's stressful. A really good question. Any other questions? I mean, let's not get bogged down on individual words. I mean, what you're doing here is you're looking at formative and summative, and it says that up here at the very top. Explanation of the formative and summative assessment used, okay? And then it goes explicit identification of types of assessment for, of, and as, formative and summative used in each of the units of work. So you've got to explain and identify, explain and identify. And that's all it's saying. Can you explain those types of assessments? Can you identify them in the unit? If you've done that, great, 8 marks. If you do it to a sophisticated level, 8 marks. If you do it to a comprehensive level, 6. Substantial, 5. Substantial, okay, but no identification of the types of assessment used, 4. And limited, or you're starting to fall away here. You're not very clear on what you're talking about. Of course, you're at the lower end of the grading scale there. So go ahead.
Hi, Colin. I would like to ask a question, because when you say identify the assessment, if you say the assessment is in this stage, for example, formative assessment, it's in explain, I think, and explore. And do you have also to actually copy, like if they have asked discussions or questions, do you have to copy those questions and show and demonstrate them, or?
That's probably overkill, Agnes. I mean, what you're doing here is you're demonstrating your understanding of 2 units. Now, we can go to the units if we really want to know what the key questions are, but you may pose 1 or 2 as an example or an illustration as to what you mean by, when you're doing formative assessment, teacher questioning, exploring this particular concept, and you may list 1 or 2 questions as an example of that and how it links motivation, engagement, and also links understandings. So that's probably where you may use some examples, but what you're really doing is explaining the 2 different types of assessments and identifying where they occur. Now, you may have 15 assessment items in a unit, and you may say there are multiple examples of formative assessment in this particular unit, and there are multiple examples of summative. I am going to provide 3 examples of formative assessment and 3 examples of summative to explain their role and to identify where they occur in the unit. Okay, so you don't have to do all 15. What you're doing here is demonstrating your knowledge. I know that there are different types of assessment, and I know that they occur in different places. I'm not going to cover 15 because, let's face it, that would drive you mad as a marker and that would drive me mad as a student. But I'm going to pick 3 formative items and 3 summative items, and I'm also going to include in that, the ones I do my recommendations on, perhaps. That could be a way of doing it. So what you're doing is you're taking a massive 112-page document called a curriculum plan, and you're breaking it down into an explanation of the formative and summative assessment, and you're identifying where key formative and summative items occur from your perspective. So they don't have to be all, they just have to be key. And you can say formative assessment is really, really, essential to developing student understandings, okay? And you can show how. Also to developing student engagement, show how, and also to motivating students over the course of an assessment task, and show how. And so you don't have to do every single individual assessment item, but pick a couple and say, I'm going to look at 3 of these, 3 formative and 3 summative, and then make some recommendations. And you may even do those recommendations on the same ones you've looked at, because it would make sense to, wouldn't it? Because that way you're not having to repeat words and develop new ideas in order to explain the recommendations you're making. So does that answer your question, Agnes?
Yes.
Yeah. So you don't have to cover every assessment item. You don't have to illustrate everything, because that's there in the lesson plan. What you have to do is say there are multiple assessment tasks. Some are formative, I'm going to pick 3 of these. Some are summative, I'm going to pick 3 of these, and show how they develop understanding, motivation, and engagement. And if you can do that in part A of the assessment, you've done a wonderful job. You've dealt with these 2 criteria here in a beautiful way. Then you can get on to the second part, which asks you to make recommendations and improve them. And here, you can, as I said in last week's lecture, you can go like a jihadist at a doomsday party. You can draw on as much relevant literature as you want. You can absolutely go crazy here and do an amazing piece of work. And I'll let
yes, but all I noticed, I have purchased some, because every time you go, wherever you go, they ask you to actually buy them. I bought them, but I don't know whether we were supposed to.
Oh, Agnes, that there are sites where you should have been able to get the curriculum resources free. Scootle was one of those. Did you go through Scootle?
There weren't many. I went. It's called the Journal of what I had to pay, but you get lots of them. Once you pay a certain price. Then if you want another article, then you pay again. Yeah.
Oh,
I bought all of them, so it's okay anyway.
Well, make sure you keep your receipt, because that is a tax deduction, Agnes. Are there any other questions about assessment there? It is a very open assessment task, and this is why I think its openness can sometimes create confusion. But basically what it's requiring you to do, and this is why I was saying it's polemic, in your introduction, tell us what you're going to do. Yeah, and you can do that in introduction. You can say, I'm going to look at 2 units of work. I'm going to identify 3 examples of formative assessment and explaining its purpose as it links to science understandings, engagement, motivation, and 3 examples of summative, identifying its purpose as it links to science understanding, engagement, and motivation. Then I can make recommendations. Okay, so tell us in your introduction and then do it. Okay.
So just to clarify that's 3 formative, 3 summative on each of those 2 units.
Yeah, that's just a guess. You may want to do 5. You may want to do 4. As many as you think you need to do to satisfy that requirement. I would, for me, there's no point. The assessment here is not saying summarize that unit. What it's saying is explain the formative and summative assessment used. So you can explain the 2 types, give a couple of examples, and then just say, yeah, this is the purpose of formative assessment in this unit. And I'm going to give 3 examples to illustrate this. This is the purpose of summative. Nobody can argue with that. That is 100% right. You don't need to do 10. 3 will do.
All right. We will go over the word limit.
Yeah, the aim is to stay in the word limit. Now, up on the forums, you'll see there's a really good example of some people who've tried to use tables. And in there, they've used dot points, and sometimes they use a reference, for example. They just put in brackets. But they're using dot points and very, very short abbreviated sentences. Now, that's all you really need to do here, because what you're doing, the unit already exists. All you're doing is explaining what formative and summative assessment is, and identifying where it occurs. That's all you're doing. So don't do all of them, do some of them. This is what formative assessment does here.
I have another question, because last time we discussed the rubric, but the one I have created, you can't use it for the both units, because if, for example, maybe unless if I did it wrong, because the one I created, you just show different stages of the actual experiment that the students would be in and how they would do as a summative assessment. And if, yeah, I couldn't see how I could incorporate 2 units in one rubric.
You would probably, you'd probably need to use your inquiry skills to do that. You'd probably be looking at developing an inquiry skills focus and applying that to 2 different investigations. And so, and with that rubric, I mean, you're right, you may well have to change the understanding component. So when a student demonstrates their knowledge, they're going to demonstrate knowledge in a certain field. So that may be their understandings. Yeah, so you may need to change the understanding component, but you would find that a lot of the inquiry skills would be quite similar.
Oh.
Maybe. It depends what you're trying to do. I mean, I'm not looking at what you're trying to do, so I can't say that's exactly what you're trying to do, but that's just one way of doing it. You know, you can change the understandings, the demonstrable understandings, and the levels of performance of those understandings, and then you can actually map that against the, you know, the inquiry skills and the steps that they should be demonstrating in terms of their inquiry and perhaps also their communication of that understanding.
Yeah, because if the way I did it was using 1 unit and being specific in what those students should demonstrate in that unit.
Good.
So I don't know. Anyway, I couldn't see any other way unless if I was to create a second rubric, or I put 2 units, 1 under. Yeah, I don't know.
Yep. Don't forget, the same rubric for a particular summative assessment task can be used for 2 different purposes. You know, one, it can actually be used for assessment, for explicating assessments, and the other one, it can actually be used for self-reflection, for getting the students to actually break down the task for their metacognition, to see how they actually understand their own learning. So one rubric can work in as you know, 2 different recommendations. So this rubric on the one hand will actually help break the task down and give the students scaffolded levels of performance.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, it's going to enable them to reflect about their learning. In other words, what steps do they have to go through? What awarenesses are they going to have to develop? And we talked in last week's lecture about 8 different kinds of knowledges: the declarative knowledge, the procedural knowledge, all the different things they're going to have to think about when they look at their assessment task, so they completely understand it before they begin. They're doing a lot of self-reflection. And then at the end, it can actually be used as a grading tool, or it can be used as a peer assessment tool also. So, you know, the teacher can grade it, and also the peers can also use the rubric to grade a student's performance.
Yeah. Couldn't we put that under the use of, like when we discuss the recommendation and we put in a rubric, we just discuss that in the actual recommendation, why the rubric is probably a good thing to use for summative assessment, for the students to know their standard and work towards what they are going to, or
yes,
or
and
the
then,
reflection, and then, yeah, I don't know, maybe
what you would need to do there, Agnes, if you want to use it for more than one recommendation, you can say, okay, recommendations for summative assessment in this particular unit focus around the rubric. Recommendation number 1, adopt the rubric for peer, for self-evaluation or self-reflection. And rubric number 2, so recommendation number 2, adopt the rubric for peer evaluation. And then you could talk in detail about those 2 recommendations.
right.
So you're in charge. The key here is throw the furniture around. Tell us what you're going to do and then do it.
Yeah, but when we do the actual rubric, we do only 1, is it? Because
in that scenario,
all you said, I put it in the peer assessment because it was one of the recommendations, and I also put it in a rubric as another recommendation for a different unit. But when I actually I actually did the actual rubric. I did it for only 1 unit.
Yep.
Huh?
Now, just
So
ask,
I'm probably
ask yourself, when you go back and look at that, Agnes, ask yourself, have you answered your own question? Have you dealt with that recommendation by using just the one rubric? If you feel you have, and you've told us that's what you're going to do, then chances are you're okay.
Oh dear, that doesn't help. I'm actually more confused now.
Okay, look, shoot it through to me in an email, and we'll deal with it, and send me through an example of what you've done, and I'll give you some comments back on it.
Okay.
So that I can actually see what you're talking about, and you know, just reassure you that what you're doing actually meets that purpose.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments about the recommendations?
Oh, can I ask another question?
Why not, Agnes?
About the recommendations, again, I have done 2 other recommendations that are similar. So I was a little bit confused. The one is using online quizzes, and another one was using ICT. So I'm not sure whether obviously when it comes to ICT, you can use different things, which I illustrated in the actual recommendation, but online quizzes is part of, like, sort of part of ICT. But yeah, I did it as a separate for a different unit again, because I thought especially in a formative assessment, because it would be nice to use online quizzes for students to be able to check their understanding, and they can do it over and over just to master the concepts that they are learning before they actually go to summative assessment. So I don't know whether it's the same or different. I have no clue. Right.
Well, I mean, to comment, you know, that does have a really good place in formative assessment, the use of online quizzes, and I'm just not quite sure how you're demarcating or differentiating between ICTs and an online quiz, because in my mind they're one and the same thing. So what you'd need to do is change the function, or have a look at, you know, what in what way the ICT is contributing to
the way I did ICT, for example, students can use iPads to do some research on a certain unit, which I put in there. But the online quizzes, they are just quizzes. They can't use any other, they just, they can use iPad to do research, but they can use online quizzes to test their knowledge and also deepen their understanding. Or they can use ICT by using interactive whiteboard. Or
maybe you could change it to like using ICT in the summative assessment, Agnes, if it's like changes it up a bit.
That's what I did. And they are all in 2 different, one recommendation is in 1 unit, the other one is in different unit. But then when you read it, you just think, oh, this is just the same recommendation, only divided into 2 units.
No, it's not, and that's, I think that was Sarah, I think, who might have thrown in that comment there. That's a really good comment, and they are actually worlds apart, because what you're doing is you're working with concepts. You're working on the reconstruction of learner concepts with the online quizzes, but with the ICT and the open research, you've got a form of guided inquiry there. So it's really important when you're quoting your literature, you start to look at those 2 different fields for your rationale. So guided inquiry is a lot different to reconstructing the learner's basic frameworks and just checking for understanding at that level. So they are quite separate functions. So make sure you bring that out. So you're on the right path. And if you focus one on formative and, as Sarah said, one on summative, then they're even more on the right path.
It's just that when you read over and over, you feel like, oh, maybe I should change, and you just get too even confused. And
and this is the thing. Do you do your part A, where you actually explain the formative and summative assessment, and then link them clearly to understandings, motivation, engagement.
Yeah.
Once you've done that, then look at the 2 units, work out which recommendations you're going to do, and then go back and write your introduction. Okay, because once you've worked out, which ones you're going to do, and it sounds to me like you're still working out how it's going to hang together, but there is a clear structure there. One is formative, one is summative. The quizzes definitely are formative. The guided inquiry and using the iPads is definitely summative. So you can actually work on those, and they're both knowledge based, so they're both related to understanding. The ICTs also do increase engagement and do increase motivation, so there's some good literature to support you there. So they are quite separate, and once you've done that, then have a read of what you've come up with, and then go back and either write your introduction once and do it as a draft, and then go back and rewrite it at the end of your paper. Because the strength of this assessment is coming out and telling us what you're going to do. Then you do it, you analyse your units, and then you make your recommendations, and then you tell us what you're told, what you've done. So the key is, complete that circle. Make sure that you're staying consistent within that.
Yeah. You see, because the units are too linked, sort of. Yeah, because melting and the melting moment and the heating up, they are all almost the same. One needs the other to happen. So and when you read off and off, I think, oh, this is just the same thing. So yeah.
But here's where you come in, because it's Agnes, the teacher, and your task is to go deeper, not wider. So here you've got similar content, similar science understandings, slightly different applications. Now you're going to demonstrate how formative and summative assessment can take a learner deeper.
Yes.
Okay, and you're right on the ball there, getting the concepts organised with your quizzes, and then applying those concepts into a deep inquiry or investigation. It's supported by ICT frameworks and platforms. Yeah, so it's sounding good.
You make it sound easy.
No, it's not easy. As I said to you, the challenge with this assessment item is it's quite open, and it's open enough to hang yourself, or it's open enough for you to narrow it down and take real control over it. And that's the key here. Narrow it down. Tell us what you're going to do. Yep.
We have only 2 days left.
That's a lot can happen in 2 days.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
I usually do my assignment when the kids are in bed anyway. I have to put my 2 kids in the bed, and then I start, and then I go. Yeah.
Which is not really high quality time, is it?
No. But what do you do with almost a 2-year-old? You can't hide. You can't. Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah. Look, I used to, when I was doing my PhD back in 1997, I think it was, I used to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and work for 3 hours on that. So I did it first in the day. And just...
That's what I do too. I have 3 kids and they harass me, so I get up before them.
Yeah, I tell you. Even when their father is here, they always rotate towards me. I don't know why.
All right. In the interest of letting people get on with their lives, are there any other questions related to the assessment task at this stage? I mean, we can talk all night about it, and I think at some levels we can only confuse your thinking. But the key here is to take control of it and narrow the task down. There's so many things you could do, but you can't comment on 15 formative items. You can't comment on 15 summative items. Just say, this is what formative does, this is what summative does, and here's 3 examples of how they build learning for understanding, engagement, and motivation. Part A done. Part B, and say, okay, looking at this particular unit, looking at this piece of formative assessment, I'd like to make 2 recommendations, and both of these centre around a rubric, or both of these centre around the adoption of ICTs. And then go crazy. Explain what you mean and why you think those recommendations will work. So take control. I mean, don't think, oh, what does he want? What do they want? What should I be? Think, what am I going to say? How can I prove this case? How can I illustrate my knowledge of 2 different types of assessment? How can I identify where they occur in 2 separate units? How can I show that they link to understanding, motivation, and engagement? And once I've done that, How can I improve on them given my working knowledge of assessment and assessment only? Because I'm talking only about assessment. You know, you're not talking about producing nice coloured cards. You're talking about how can the assessment of this be better understood and better developed. The final slide I wanted to look at is the criteria on reporting. Now, Melanie sent through her comment. This is the descriptor that should be on that page. What's happened is the links in that, I don't know what's gone with Moodle, this term, quite frankly, but you know, every week I'm on there fixing things up. And what it's done is reconnected to an old form in a previous version of the unit. Now, it doesn't matter. It's not dramatically wrong. But criteria 4 in the old unit talked about reporting to parents. Now that belongs to the last assessment task. So you can see it, you know, Melanie was quite astute to pick up. That doesn't even belong to this task. So this is the form. I've checked it again now. The link is correct. So you'll see this criteria there. So, and the 4th criteria is really about your report. Have you done a cohesive report that's consistent with academic conventions? And are you using relevant and credible sources to explain your concepts? And as we said in the forum last week, scientific concepts here basically mean pedagogy. You know, are you explaining your pedagogy, the pedagogy of your assessment here explicitly and clearly? The second one here, you can see if you're scoring it at a high level, clear and concise application of a report genre is evident. Introduction is concise and it signposts your response. All aspects of the task have been explicitly addressed and they model academic conventions. Extensive use of relevant and credible sources for explanation of pedagogical and scientific concepts. If you're doing that, then chances are you're scoring high in that criteria.
Colin, if we've already like integrated the parent part of it, does it matter?
No, it doesn't. If you've done that, I mean, it's quite possible to do that. It is quite possible to do that. So, you know, really clear assessment, if you think about it, what is the purpose of assessment? And one of those is communicating to the learner and parents, feeding back. So, you know, it's logical. Most people would probably want to include that anyway, but you don't need to, okay? And if you have, it will certainly be acknowledged as you know, part of that essential assessment feedback. But, you know, focusing here on the limit of words, how many words you can actually fit in, how many ideas you can fit in a limited number of words. So, you know, you won't be penalised if you've put that in already. You won't be penalised if you leave it out, because really this criteria is focusing on how you've taken control of the task. Have you narrowed it down, defined what assessment is, what, you know, where it's located in your units, how it can be improved, and you've told us you're going to do this, you've defined how you're going to do it, you've gone through and done it, actually done it, visibly done it in your report, and then in your conclusion, you point again to what you did and how you did it. If you've done that, then this criteria is really a bonus for you, because it's you know, it's the work you need to do, the cognitive work you need to do to make this assessment task work for you and be effective. So, and if you've already included reporting to parents, great, because that is a function of assessment. You know, so you're not incorrect. It's just not compulsory you do that. Any other questions? Can I encourage you, please, to put in your evaluations? It's particularly important to me as distance students, because you technically are my cohort and my responsibility. This is a course that I have inherited from Linda Pfeiffer, who's taught it previously. So we've made a few changes, but you know, I'm really interested in the sorts of changes that you think could be made for the better for the future. So if something has worked and you have enjoyed it, let me know. If something hasn't worked and you haven't enjoyed it as much, let me know. Okay, I really value your feedback, and our aim, of course, is to get this assignment back to you within 2 weeks, within 10 days of university, so that you can you know where you stand, and you've got a timely feedback on your assessment efforts. So if there's no other questions, I'll hit the record button on this and get it posted up onto the forum and for people who can't be here tonight to look at.
Thank you.
Any questions, please shoot them through via email. This is the time of year where I'm quite attentive and looking, you know, to help and add a little bit of light where I can. So please, if you do feel stuck in any way, make sure you shoot it through. I would be delighted to help where I can.
Thanks, Colin. I'll see you later. Bye.
Thank you all, and thank you for your input this term too. It's been an absolute delight working with you, and I've really enjoyed the questions and the contribution you've made, so thank you.
Okay, thank you. Oh, this is the second time anyway we were together.
Indeed, indeed. All right.
Okay, bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.